and VP of Engineering at DRI, and historian David Laws. As always, thank you to the generous support of our Friends Foundation and the Laws Local History Fund that allowed us to bring you this event.
Thank you. This is quite extraordinary. Can you all hear me? Is this loud enough? Okay. This is quite extraordinary. We expected a few friends grouped around the front here listening to us. A lot of folks worked at DRI, and I understand it was a lot of fun, and I hope we learned something about that today. My background and my involvement with this is I'm semiconductor curator at the Computer History Museum down at View, and I've done a lot of oral histories and also helped put plaques at various places in Silicon Valley where important stuff happened, like the birthplace of Silicon Valley, Moore's Law, and others. And when I came down to Pacific Grove and started talking around, somebody, I don't remember who it was, said, well, there's some important stuff happened down here. You should probably check it out. So I did a little bit of research and came across this guy called Tom Rolander. And now this started a process, so we worked with the IEEE to put in a plaque outside the original headquarters of DRI, which is on the corner of Lighthouse Avenue there. And in 2014, we put the plaque in there and again had a big gathering of a lot of folks that worked at DRI. And sort of 10 years later, we realized that this is the 50th anniversary of the year in which Gary booted up the first version of CP/M and in many ways helped change the world. And so that's the basis for the story and why we're here. If you read the Board and Banton, which is the journal of the Historical Society, that's a story on the right that I wrote about it in the magazine this year about Gary Kildall's story. And if you read that, you can go to sleep for the next 20 minutes because you know the whole story anyway. If you didn't, there are a few copies over on the side here, $5 each. You can buy afterwards. We're happy to sell a few. Let's get on with the story here. So Gary Kildall, as you know, was the heart and soul, along with his wife Dorothy, in the founding of this digital research company. And Gary was born in Seattle in 1942. He married his childhood sweetheart, Dorothy McEwen, in 63, and 67, he graduated from the University of Washington with a BS in mathematics. And this was about the time of draft for Vietnam. Gary didn't fancy getting shipped off to Vietnam, so he signed up for a commission with the Navy and stayed in this country pretty much all the time. And after he finished his service, he was hired as a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. And that's where he began to get involved with the products we're going to talk about today. Got to press the right button. Here we go. So Gary's at the Naval Postgraduate School, and he comes across a new product from Intel. Intel created in 1971 the first commercially successful microprocessor. Essentially, in those days, you'd call it a computer on a chip. And playing around with this, he actually spent $25 to buy his own, got involved with Intel and became a contractor for Intel, writing software to support their microprocessors. And at one point, he was given a new system, this Intel 8 we have up on the left-hand side, and was trying to work with it, but they had no way to transfer data from the data sources that they had, which were floppy disks, into that microcomputer, as he would call it. And so he worked for a long time on a software routine that he eventually called it CP/M, Control Program for Microcomputers, and together with a friend, managed to connect it through a cable to this 8-inch floppy disk drive, which came from Sugar, Some names might be familiar here. Al had quite a role locally with the restaurants, and was able to transfer data backwards and forwards from the floppy disk drive to the computer. This turned out to be quite an exciting invention. He did this in the back woodshed at the back of the Kildall home on Bayview Avenue, and he and John Torode, the gentleman he worked with on the hardware side, realized that this was an extraordinary capability that now you could have on your own desktop, a machine with the power of what that time was a very big business computer, IBM S370, and it was right at the fingertips rather than having to go down to the computer room to use it. And he realized that this was an important piece of software, and started selling it via mail. I think they were about $70, $80 a piece. And it started becoming very popular with all the small microcomputer startups that were there in Silicon Valley, and eventually became adopted as a standard. So he expanded from their little house into this office at 716 Lighthouse. You're probably familiar with that. And by 1980, he had about 20 employees working out of the Victorian at the corner, which is where we put the plaque 10 years ago. And in fact, also then expanded into another building, the engineering building, which is now the worldwide international headquarters of the Carmel Pinecone. And interesting story there that Tom likes to tell, so I'll steal it from him, is that one afternoon, Gary came into the office and said, I'm going to give you guys a raise over the weekend. And everybody was very happy about that until they came to work on Monday morning and found the raise was they'd raised the building 5 feet so they could put a big new computer down there in the basement. And this company was very successful. By 1980, 81, more than 1 million people worldwide were using CP/M, and the idea of the personal computer was booming. There were many, many still startups, including Apple, of course, and others, that IMSI and Osborne, the first portable computer. And Gary was really a rock star. He made pretty good money. He was flying up to his customers in the Bay Area, and he has a weekly television program, Computer Chronicles, broadcast on a PBS station. So many of those videos that were made at that stage, you can still see them on YouTube if anyone wants to follow up and see Gary at work. And then a big change came around the world. Many, many big corporate customers were getting requests from their employees to bring in little personal computers into the big office, and they were very concerned about having to work with all these little startup companies, and talked to IBM, who was the major supplier of computers at the time, and encouraged IBM to start their own PC. So IBM initiated Project Chess in 1980, and they needed some software. Number of things, application programs, and an operating system. Bill Gates was one of Gary's customers. He had been buying CP/M to bundle together with BASIC and then selling that as a finished product. And IBM thought that Gates owned CP/M. So they went up to Seattle, met with Gary, met with Bill, and he pointed out that he did not own rights to CP/M. They'd have to go see this guy called Gary Kildall down in Pacific Grove. And so Gates was sworn to secrecy. He calls Gary and says, there's some important people coming tomorrow. You need to be there to meet with them. Gary says, I can't meet. I've got important visitors up in the Bay Area that I have to go see, but we'll try to figure it out. And so Gary did fly up to the Bay Area, did his business, flew back again, met with IBM in the afternoon, had a long discussion with them, and they basically wanted to buy his whole software package for a lump sum of $250,000 and no royalties. Well, that would have really destroyed Gary's business because he had pricing agreements with all his customers that if he gave anyone a lower price, they would get the benefit of that. So they were unable to reach agreement on the price that day, but they left and Gary thought he had a handshake to continue discussions, and he felt there would be a way to work that out. And 2 weeks later, he still hasn't heard from IBM. So he makes an inquiry, and then he finds out that Gates has managed to buy basically a clone of CPM that is designed to work with Intel's next generation processor from a little company in Seattle, the Seattle Computer Products, I think was the name. It was busy selling that to IBM. They had no need to talk to Gary anymore. And the reason that this company had built it, they wanted to use CPM on the new microprocessor from Intel, which was being used in the IBM PC. And that's the only reason at all why it was ever cloned in that manner. So the decision at that point, so Gates now had his MS-DOS basically for $10,000, was busy doing business with IBM, and Gary said, hey, you can't do that. They didn't copy the source code, but they used an awful lot of proprietary information that went into the design of that software. An agreement was made between IBM and Digital Research that they would also offer CPM as an alternative to the customer. So when the products came out, there were 2 software operating systems available, CPM from Digital Research and PC-DOS based on the Microsoft product from IBM. And the hooker now was that, of course, that IBM charged, I think it was $50 for PC-DOS and $250 for CPM. And if you were just walking into a computer store to buy your computer for the first one, which choice would you make? That made all the difference in terms of the success of the product. So, 1981, Gary decides to basically cash out as much as he can. He sold the company sold Digital Research to a Boston private equity company, TA Associates, and they ran the company for several years. It did pretty well in many ways. It went through several more big offices, eventually to this big office out on Garden Road in Monterey. But fundamentally, with the loss of the base operating system business for DRI, the company didn't make it in the long term, and they sold the company, and the rest is history with the success that Microsoft was able to build on the work that was done at DRI. So Gary retired from DRI in 1985, as did Tom, as you will hear, and he was a wealthy man, had a lot of toys, cars, airplanes, but forever he was haunted by this taunt that you could have been Bill Gates. There was all over the news and many places on the internet these stories, and the story got around and was spread even more that Gary lost the deal because he was out flying when IBM came. Well, that's not true, as we know. He was there, they were just unable to consummate the deal. Towards the end of 1991, Gary decided that he was going to write the story of his involvement with the computer business and the disappointments with IBM. He did publish 50 copies of his computer connections that he sent out to friends, and a copy of half of that, the first half, is now available on the website at the Computer History Museum. But eventually, Gary fell, accident in Monterey, and he died of concussion a couple of days later. So it's a fascinating story, and Gary certainly made many, many important major contributions to the development of software, and is renowned throughout the world for the contributions that he made. And this story is written up by Harold Evans in a book, They Made America 2 Centuries of Innovators, which really tells the contributions that Gary made in a lot more detail than we can cover tonight. So This is the plaque, which is about 801 Lighthouse Avenue that we put in 10 years ago. And at this point, you heard the bones of the story, and I'd like to invite Tom Rolander to come and join us. And Tom and I will have a conversation and talk about his perspectives on life during the boom and bust years of DRI. So Tom, can you bring your chair up? Okay. So I will read Tom's resume here. Well, actually, it's most of you know him anyway, but I think it gives important background to the story. If you'd like to hear the full story, I did record a 3-hour oral history of Tom for him 10 years ago. He has promised he won't spend 3 hours on it tonight, but there's an awful lot to Tom's personal story that we can't get into tonight. So if you look for oral histories on the Computer History website under Tom Rolander, you can either watch the whole thing on YouTube or you can read the transcript. So Tom Rolander was born in Tanzania in East Africa, where his parents were Lutheran missionaries. They returned to the US when he was young, and the family spent a while in New Jersey before moving to Seattle. After high school, Tom headed to the University of Washington, where he earned a BS in civil engineering and an MSc in electrical engineering. On graduating in 1976, Tom spent several years with Intel in Santa Clara working on microprocessor software. And then in 1979, Tom moved to Pacific Grove to join Digital Research, where he wore employee badge number 1 and served as Vice President of Engineering and later of Research and Development. It's almost also where he met his wife, Laurie. Laurie's around here somewhere today. And Gary served at best man at their wedding as Tom did at his. After Digital Research was sold to Novell in 1991, actually he'd left 5 years earlier to start another company, Knowledge Set. Probably don't have time to get into it tonight. But he led 3 successful software companies after that. Now retired, he was a volunteer mentor in circuit design, software engineering, and 3D printing at Stanford's Hopkins Marine Station here in Pacific Grove. Those who know Tom outside the software world will recall that in his younger days, he was an avid cyclist, pilot, sailor, and runner. He's completed more than 100 marathons, as well as serving as president of the Big Sur Marathon Foundation. He's also a master calligrapher, so please welcome Tom.
Thank you.
So Tom, perhaps you could give us a little story about how you first met Gary.
Okay. Actually, I'd like to do a little preamble to that, which is my motivation for being here tonight. David came to me a few months ago and said, Tom, would you be interested in talking about digital research and providing some history for the people in this fine town? And of course, I agreed to do that. And what I want you to take away with tonight is the next time you bring visitors into this town, I want you to look at them and proudly say to them that years before Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, the very, very first personal computer in the world ran here in Pacific Grove. That's the way I've introduced this town to all of my friends that have come here.
So tell us, how did you first meet Gary, Tom?
Okay, how did I first meet Gary? Well, I had, my very first meeting with Gary was actually at the University of Washington. I think a lot of us have had those serendipity moments. You think of them as coincidences or accidents, but you have to pay attention to them. So I was in the computer lab at the U of W late one night, or somewhere between midnight and probably 2 in the morning, and a young kid came in. He had reddish hair, freckles, he had cutoffs. You remember the old blue jean cutoffs with the strings hanging down by the knees? This guy came in, and he had with him a leather briefcase. He opened up that leather briefcase, and he plugged in an ASR 33. You know what a teletype is? Remember teletypes? He plugged that in. And he started typing on this machine. And he had basically the first microcomputer I ever saw. I wanted to know where he got it, what he was doing with it, and how I could get one. So we spent until sunrise the next morning talking about that machine, and I was passionate about it. So we had several more times that we met at the U of W. I went on to finish my master's in EE. Gary got his PhD in computer science. And we were separated for a number of years. Well, I got recruited after I graduated with my EE degree by Intel to come down to Santa Clara and join the Microcomputer Systems Division. And that was awesome. I really thought that was a great opportunity. I left Seattle and came down to California. Well, at Intel, shortly after I was there, one day I was walking down the hall, and there is Gary again. Okay, another coincidence? You got to pay attention. So we started talking. We went out to lunch, talked a few times, and I found out Gary was consulting at Intel. He was, in fact, at that particular point in time, he had written the PLM compiler. That's a program language for microcomputers. So Gary, as a compiler developer, that's what he did as his PhD at the U of W. He was writing the compiler for Intel's 8008 at that time. So he wrote it in Fortran, he generated code for that microcomputer, and I was one of his test cases. So I was testing his new compiler. So I would write some application programs that I did for the Microcomputer Systems Division, and then we would test them and make sure that his compiler was generating the correct code to be able to run that. So that's how we began.
And important point to note here is that Intel did not have the best microprocessor at the time. They did have the best software to support it, and that's how Intel really became such a successful manufacturer in the early days, because they gave tools to the engineers that allowed them to use their chip more efficiently than any other manufacturers did. And so Gary contributed an awful lot to the early success of Intel. We shouldn't forget that. So, okay, Tom, so now you've been at Intel. I think you went off and had some more fun along the way somewhere. And then Gary contacted you and said, would you like to come to DRI?
Yeah,
I think you had a pretty unusual interview, as I understand.
Yeah, Gary started recruiting me to come down to Pacific Grove. Well, when I came down to Intel, I had only been over to the ocean a couple of times. Basically, Intel was, you really got sucked into that environment, and I was working an awful lot of hours. Kept running into Gary, and he said, Tom, you got to come down. I'm starting a software company in Pacific Grove. You've got to come down and join me. And finally, after he'd asked me a number of times, I said, Gary, look, if I come down, see what you have, understand what you want me to do, and if I'm not happy with that, will you leave me alone? He said, sure. So the directions he gave me, remember this is end of 78, early 79, when I first came down. His directions were to come into town, and this preceded the aquarium. In fact, at that point in time, the rec trail was nothing but railroad tracks and dirt. And so he brought me in down along Canterbury Row, no aquarium, around to Lover's Point, and then right up Pacific Avenue to Lighthouse, and then one block up to Willow. Well, by then, I was sold. I mean, my God, I'm thinking, you mean I was up in Santa Clara with millions of people up in the Bay Area, and I could live down here and actually write software? Anyway, I was kind of sold on that. So I came, parked in front of the Victorian house. Well, that was unlike anything I'd ever seen as an office. 801 Lighthouse, the corner of Willow and Lighthouse. So I came into the door, went up to the front, and said, I'm here to see Gary. And they directed me upstairs to the master bedroom. So I went up the stairs, and there's Gary at the back of his office. He's got a big desk with a couple of computers on it. And next to the computer was a model of an airplane. So as I walked in the door and shook his hand, I said, so Gary, what's with the PA-22? Is it a 160 or 180 engine? And he said, are you a pilot? And I said, of course. He paused and looked at me and he said, so Tom, are you current in type? Well, that was a leading question. What that means is, did I have a license and was I current that I could climb on that airplane and fly it legally with passengers? And I said, of course. At that point, he said, let's go. We got up, we walked down to his car. Gary always had good cars. This was a Porsche, I think it was a 914 or something. And we drove out to the airport. We got there, we pulled his PA-22, it was a 180, out of the hangar. We got in it, and the reason why Gary was so interested in me being current in type is that he had just got his instrument rating. When you have an instrument rating, you actually have to go and fly approaches, continually approaches, to be able to keep your license current. And so what you do is you put a hood on where you can't see outside the aircraft. All you can see are the instruments. And obviously to do that, you need somebody sitting next to you that's watching what's going on and knows what to do with other aircraft and air traffic control and whatever. So that's how Gary and I began. And from then on, we spent almost 1,000 hours flying together. So I was always Gary's co-pilot.
So you said you accepted the job?
I accepted the job. I think I started about the next Monday or so.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of products that you worked on?
Well, at Intel, I had been a co-designer for RMX-80, which was their real-time multitasking kernel. And what Gary wanted to do is he saw that we currently had 8-bit processors. He wanted to get ahead of the curve here to develop a real-time kernel. What that meant is you could do more than one thing at a time. You could actually run a word processor as well as doing maybe a spreadsheet or some application like that. Or simply print in the background while you had the other programs running. So he wanted a real-time kernel. And I had developed one or co-developed one at Intel. And so Gary brought me in initially to do MPM, which was the multitasking kernel.
Good. Tell us a little bit about the company culture at that time. Cut-off jeans and roller skates, I understand. were part of
Jeans,
it.
roller skates. Gary had a lot of 39th birthdays. It kind of became a joke. At his first 39th birthday, we basically had parties on Friday afternoons. There were picnic tables out there. We had about, maybe in 1980, 81, we had, I think, 20 people. And so there was always a TGIF on Friday afternoon. That was a big tradition of the company. One particular occasion, which happened to be his birthday, 39th, we ran out of champagne. So Gary had been given roller skates, inline skates for a birthday. And he decided that he would get to Ron's Liquor. And if you know the hill, there's actually a substantial downhill on Lighthouse as you get down to Congress, and then an uphill to get to Ron's Liquor. Anyway, he made it back somehow with champagne.
That tells a lot about the company culture, Tom. Can you tell us anything about Gary's strengths as a boss in terms of coaching people? But also, I guess he wasn't quite as interested in the running of the business on a day-to-day basis.
No kidding. Gary was a technologist. He was a nerd's nerd. In fact, this evening I came with my pocket protector, plastic pocket protector, and actually my ID number 1 from Digital Research. So Gary was, he was actually not much of a manager. He was a good teacher. And there's a big difference, I think, between a manager and a teacher. Gary loved to explain things. So when you were given a task, Gary would very clearly explain what that task was and what he expected to be done with that task. And Gary was very good at that. Compare that to his management style. When we moved into 734 Lighthouse, there were about 15 engineers at the time. Gary would bring us together every week or two. He would have us all sit in his office, and he would go to the whiteboard and he would write down everybody's name on one side. He'd go to the other side and he'd write down all the products that we're kind of working on. And he would sort of draw lines from one side to the other side of the board. And then the meeting would be over. So he was not really into management, but teaching was excellent. He was really good at explaining the problems and what we were working on.
So during much of this time in the day-to-day running was pretty much Dorothy's responsibility?
Yeah, Dorothy was running the business. She was doing all the marketing and sales. I think by late 1980 into 81, there were actually sales force that was hired and people that were brought in to do marketing. But Gary would much rather be writing code. It turned out that his vice president of engineering was more interested also in writing code than managing. I learned that a hard way.
So now we get to the IBM PC story. A lot of rumors and a lot of innuendos associated with that. But from your perspective, I'd like to hear a little bit about, but I know Gary had some kind of a relationship with Gates before, right? I believe when Gates had his company in Albuquerque, he was trying to figure out where to take it. IBM has now arrived at Pacific Grove. They want to talk to Gary about licensing CP/M for their new computer. And Gary was out of town. I believe you were with him that day. Can you tell us a little about what went on?
Yeah. Okay. The way this story evolved, as David mentioned earlier, was that IBM thought, because of this CP/M card in the Apple, that it was Microsoft that owned CP/M. Well, they didn't. Well, what happened is they called Gary, and this was on a Tuesday week, and that was in 1980, and they said, we'd like to come down and see you on Thursday. So it was actually 2 days later. Well, Gary said, I've already got a meeting on Tuesday morning, but you can come down, we can get started with the meeting with our staff, and I'll be back about lunchtime or after lunch to meet with you. So what happened was Gary and I flew the plane up to the Bay Area, we're at Oakland Airport. There was a gentleman named Bill Godbout, who was the president of CompuPro, and we met with him. We were delivering a new version of that time CP/M2. And so we had the meeting, and then we flew back down, and we came into Digital Research.
So the bottom line is he wasn't out flying when he did meet with IBM and held an extended conversation.
He did meet with IBM. The meeting did not go well because what happened is Digital Research, we had a license, we had at that point, ultimately we had over 1,000 OEMs. So we had a way of doing business, and it was all based upon the quantity of our product that you would buy. So you'd get a product for $25 a piece if it was at 1,000 copies, and you get it down to $10 if you bought 100,000 copies. IBM wanted a fully paid up license, but it wasn't the way we were doing business. So we told them how we would license our product to IBM. They said, we understand, and that meeting ended.
And then, as I mentioned before, IBM found an alternative source of software.
Well, at that point, apparently Bill had understood that nothing had proceeded with Digital Research. Well, we had thought that IBM was going to come back to us and specify a number of quantity of products that they wanted to purchase from us. And we thought it was fine. Well, what we learned from one of our consultants was that Bill Gates had gone to Seattle Computer Products and bought a product called QDOS. Well, QDOS stood for Quick and Dirty DOS. So you might imagine how that was developed. It was developed because they used the API, the complete interface of CP/M between application programs and the operating system as their base. And so that enabled them to develop it very quickly. And so Bill had bought that, and then he turned around and sold that to IBM.
So he basically got the beginnings of the Microsoft Colossus for, I think it was $10,000 he paid for it, and I believe they ponied up another $40,000 sometime down the road.
Yeah, so basically, we knew now that IBM was licensing through Microsoft this QDOS, which they were going to call PC-DOS. Well, we were already in the process at that point in time through our attorney, Jerry Davis, of filing a lawsuit against Seattle Computer Products for copying the API of CP/M for using our proprietary materials. So we told that to IBM. Well, you might imagine there was panic at IBM, and so they said, well, let's talk about this. So what they did is they brought Gary and myself and Jerry Davis out to Boca Raton to meet with Don Estridge, who's head of the IBM PC. Met with them, and they explained. We also showed them our multitask conversion because that's where we thought the system was going. Well, at the end of that meeting, IBM said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to conduct business the way you want to do it. We're going to go ahead and license, I can't remember the number of copies, they'll say 100,000 copies. We'll pay you for that. And we're also going to pay you to write the BIOS, to do the custom version of that software to run on this machine. So that sounded pretty good so far. Then they said, well, there's one kind of catch to this, and that is that you have to agree not to sue IBM or Microsoft if you agree to have us license your software.
End of story.
Yeah, so what happened is then, as David mentioned earlier, so months went on. I was assigned, I was running engineering, so the task fell upon me to organize the team and to to take CPM 86 and do the BIOS version for the IBM PC. In that process, early on, one of the days, early days in that process, IBM delivered a PC to our office. We were at 734 Lighthouse. They brought up, it was almost like one of the bank vehicles of Brink's Vault. They came in with it. They had people, it was almost chained to somebody's wrist. They came in the door. We had to have key card in, key card out, so they kept track of everybody that came into the machine. And it was on the second floor of 734. Those of us engineers, myself in particular, came in and we had our first glimpse of the IBM PC. This is before it was announced. We opened it up, took a look inside it, and went, oh my God, this is what we're waiting for? This is what's going to beat all the rest of the computers that are out there right now? It was kind of a ho-hum experience. But we went ahead, we did the documentation for it, we did the BIOS for it, and we prepared it for IBM's introduction, which was in August of 1981. Well, for the announcement, Gary and I went flying. We got the airplane, we flew up to San Jose, and we went to the IBM store to have a look at this, because what IBM was going to do is they said, we're not going to bundle. We're not going to put the operating system with the computer. We're going to sell them in separate boxes. So here's the box with the computer in it. And then there's a box here with PC-DOS, a box with CPM86, box with the UCSDP system. And we thought that was going to be fair. Well, Gary and I got up there, walked into the store, and here was the machine. I think it was about $1,700 for the machine. It was pretty expensive. Here was PC-DOS, which was actually $40, and next to it was CPM86, which was $240. 6 times as much for an operating system that would run the same applications. I described it, by the way, as a slap in the face. We called this kind of an end of innocence. Up to that point in time, you see, Gary was collegiate. He was a college professor that was pitted against a combination of Bill Gates, the most ruthless businessman of the last century, and IBM. Who's going to win? And it was just this, it never occurred to us that somebody would price our product like that, obviously trying to destroy us in the market.
So the innocence is gone. DRI has a good base of business, continues to run that for several years, and I think you brought out quite a lot of really interesting products. Can you tell me some of them? Yeah,
Gary had developed a PL180, so we had some more language tools that were out there. Gary had acquired CBasic from Gordon Eubanks, so we had some other tools. And one of the important things that I should mention about this time is that Gary was very big in promoting what was called the ISV, Independent Software Vendor. And there were several of these companies that wanted to have us acquire their products. In fact, one of them was MicroPro. They did a WordMaster and WordStar, and they were trying to get Gary to buy that. And Gary's argument was no. He wouldn't bundle or sell applications from the same company that did an operating system, because that would create a monopoly. That was pretty well predicted what happens right now. Any of you with Windows computers, I guarantee, come pre-installed with, with all of the applications, the Excel, the Word, etc. So that actually was true. Gary would not compete with his application vendors.
And business strategy that made just such a total difference in the long run there. Yeah. So what happened at DRI? You stayed with the DRI until 85, I think, Tom?
Yeah, we stayed till 85.
And you'd moved out, you had down on 160 Lighthouse?
Well, actually, yeah, so we started in 801, gravitated, got bigger and moved to include 734. Then we moved to 160 Central, which is where the aquarium has its accounting office, across from Happy Girl Kitchen. That was another story. And then from there, we went out to Garden Road. And at that time, the company was close to 500 people. So there was quite a bit of expansion through those years. I think that one of the peaks of the business was probably late in 1983. In early 83, spring of 83, there was CPM 83, it was called, a conference. It was in the Moscone Center. And there were hundreds of software vendors that were there, and Digital Research actually hosted that particular event. Well, by then, the OEMs were beginning to move over to IBM PC and were creating PC-compatible machines. And so if I look at the rise and fall of digital research, if I were to give you that one point, that one tipping point, which headed the downward, ultimately, trajectory for digital research, it was that pricing of $40 versus $240.
And then the next step was probably the fact that the IBM PC became such a standard, because they had the IBM name behind it, that everybody else then started building IBM-compatible PCs.
Yeah.
And as you say, so the OEMs began to desert CPM and go with MS-DOS.
I'm probably one of the few people around that would admit that I did not believe IBM would be a success. That indicates my business and marketing acumen. I will stand on my record writing code. I've written a lot of successful code and products. My marketing hasn't been worth crap.
Well, no, but IBM did not have a record of being successful in businesses like that. They had done a lot of small side businesses to try to expand into smaller companies. And this was just very different from the pattern that had run before. So your expectations were not founded.
What David asked me earlier, and that was about the transition out of digital research. Gary was way ahead of me by a couple of years in terms of getting out of any management and writing code. Gary was still back. He had a great office where he was writing code. He was very interested in some consumer products. He was interested in optical discs, and so that became one of his areas of interest. And it turned out that digital research at that time was beginning to retreat, focus back into a narrower business. And so Gary actually went to the board and said, I'm interested in pursuing optical disc. The CD-ROM had come out. And here was an optical disc storage that could be stamped out and pressed, manufactured for pennies, or maybe no less than $1, no more than $1. And this was a new storage medium. And so he saw the future of that, putting books on that kind of disc, and went to the board and said, he was on the board, and said, I would like to go out as a separate venture and do that. I want to make sure that it's clear I can do that outside of digital research. They agreed. And so Gary and I went off, the two of us, to form a company called Knowledge Set. And what we did is we went to Grolier. We got their tapes for their database, which was the entire Grolier Encyclopedia. And we developed the Grolier Encyclopedia on CD. So the very first CD-ROM that you could buy in the industry was from Knowledge Set. And we developed that using the Grolier Encyclopedia.
Some other areas that Gary liked to tinker in, he started some work with 3D spinning objects on the screen.
Gary was a consummate nerd. He was just always following what was going on with the next technology and the next step. One of the things I encourage people to do, particularly young engineers starting out in their careers, are to experiment with the new toys. New engineers ought to be trying out drones. That's a new technology out there. It's going to expand. It's going to be everywhere. We're going to see that. AI is another example right now today. New engineers, you've got to learn that. You've got to get involved with that. And so these are areas that are very important.
After Gary died, accolades came in from all over the world for the contributions he had made to computers. Can you remember some of the most significant?
Yeah, I think when we get back to what we remember about Gary, he was fun to be around. We all enjoyed Gary's company. He worked very, very hard, worked late, worked lots of hours, and he played very hard as well. Some of the stories that Lori can relate to is Gary would call me frequently or often in the middle of the night because he had just got a piece of software working. I mean, what I share today, that is the joy of building something and seeing it run, especially for the first time. That's what I'm doing over at Hopkins right now for 25 or 30 hours a week. I just love building something new. Gary conveyed that and passed that love of building something on to everybody that worked with him. That was a huge part of what we remember about Gary.
Other things he'd like to have fun with. You were describing snow on the runway at South Lake Tahoe.
Okay.
There's that story.
Gary, so my working relationship with Gary, what he liked is to work with people that were pretty competent. They could do most of the job themselves. He could do some teaching for maybe some of the difficult technical parts of something, but he would encourage you to go on your own. If you were going to affect something he was working on, you needed to talk with him. So when Gary would come into my office, I wouldn't know if he was going to talk with me about technology or if we were going to go play. So one particular day, he came into my office, and we had a twin-engine airplane at that time. Gary said he had just been reading articles about how to land a twin-engine airplane and control it landing in snow. And he said, Tom, there's 4 inches of snow up at South Shore, South Lake Tahoe. Let's go. I want to try this out. So I was a very willing passenger, the co-pilot of his airplane. And we got in the airplane, we flew up to Tahoe, and sure enough, our first couple landings were pretty exciting. One other example of what Gary would do, especially in the summer, he had a water ski boat and a pickup truck. And he'd come into my office and say, Tom, let's go water skiing. What that meant is, Tom, you drive the boat, I want to ski. So we did that a lot in the early years.
Okay, I think you participated in reading a eulogy at Gary's postgraduate school, wasn't it?
Yeah, when Gary passed away on July 11th, 1994, at the age of 52. And the day he passed away, his son and daughter, Scott and Christy, contacted me and they said, Tom, we want you to lead the memorial service for Gary. This crowd reminds me of that event because it was at NPS. And we were in their large auditorium, and it was standing room only. There were people that came from all over the world to honor Gary and his accomplishments. And so they made entries in a memorial book that we have there, and all those were copied and retained. But what I want to close with here is what we put on the outside of the memorial notice. So this is the memorial, a copy of it. It was handed out to all of the people that came to that event. Gary was a pioneer who brought order into the early chaos of the PC industry by providing focus, leadership, and vision. In a competitive and often impersonal microcomputer industry, Gary showed us that friends and business associates are one and the same, his family and friends. We'll long remember him. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions, but before we even get to the questions, is there anybody from DRI here today that would like to come up and relate something about their time at... Laurie, I'd like you to come up and take the first one.
He said it all.
He said, okay, so no skeletons in the closet that anybody wants to release
How many
today.
use CPM?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. How many of you have used CPM computers?
That's good. Yeah.
And how many of you have told, when you bring visitors and people in town, this is where it all started? Good for you. Thank you.
And how many ex-DRI employees are there here? Can we have some hands? A few.
Good.
Yeah, good. Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So, okay, any questions? If you could take the microphone, because it is being recorded back there, if you could pass that.
All right. I think we'll have to repeat it because...
Ah.
I actually have two questions. One is to clarify some gossip, and the industry has a lot of gossip about the meeting between IBM and DRI. And one technical question. So the first one is, part of the gossip is that IBM came early and Jerry and Dorothy were somewhat put off by IBM's insistence on signing a confidentiality agreement, and that at that point it was somewhat antagonistic meeting. My technical questions, I'll put this away. I was wondering from your background if you had very much to do with double DOS.
With what?
Double DOS, the first sort of dual user version of the DOS,
Yeah.
DRS DOS program.
Okay.
First question was about
No, that was the second question here.
about DRI's resistance to signing IBM's
Yeah,
non-disclosure
okay, the
agreement.
non-disclosure agreement. I was focused on the second question when you got to that because I don't know that I know of double DOS, which answers that question. As far as when IBM came, what Gary had set up was IBM would come in and they would, the chess team, and they would meet with Dorothy. They did that, and the first thing they presented Dorothy with was what we call a unidirectional non-disclosure agreement. So this unidirectional was that anything that DRI told IBM was regarded by IBM as public domain. In other words, none of it was secret. And furthermore, the fact that IBM came and met with Digital Research was regarded as secret. So right away, that raised the hackles on Dorothy. And she actually contacted Jerry Davis and brought Jerry Davis into it. And they decided they were unwilling at that point in the meeting to sign the non-disclosure. So what happened then is when Gary and I came in and arrived for the meeting, understood that they wanted us to sign this agreement. I don't know, Gary and I kind of looked at each other and said, well, what was going on in our mind is IBM's not going to be successful, so why don't we go ahead and sign this? So that was the undercurrent, and not something that went out, of course, in the public. But we went ahead and signed the agreement.
Another question, and rather than pass the mic, I'll repeat it. So, yes, Ken.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you have any personal feelings about the actual accident at the bar, if there was anything nefarious about it, or if you ever heard anything about anything to do with it.
I'm being asked if there's anything nefarious about Gary's event of his passing. That's a very difficult time, and Gary and I were best friends. We shared a lot of confidences, and that's not a subject I'm willing to talk about. So I'm not willing to speculate about it, I'm not willing to talk about it, and I have not lent any energy whatsoever to that subject. And that tells you a little bit about who Tom Rolander is. Gary sometimes he described me as a Pollyanna, somebody that always saw the good in people, was somebody that was always happy and uplifting. And that was the kind of people that Gary brought around him. And so that's what I want to leave you with Gary. It was obviously a challenge for him. And Dave mentioned the book that he wrote. And so there's one little story that's appropriate to that. Because if I look for an inflection point or tipping point at Digital Research, that was when they priced us at $240 and PC-DOS at $40. Okay, the tipping point for Gary was that Gary was in that first graduating class. And in late 1992, the University of Washington was at the 25th anniversary of the forming of their computer science department. And Gary was in that first graduating class. So in the end of 92, what they did is they decided we're going to have a 25th anniversary celebration. Word got passed around among the 20 PhD graduates that there were from the UW. Gary was truly excited about going there and seeing his friends, seeing those people he hadn't seen for many years. Then what he found out was, guess who was going to be the keynote speaker? Bill Gates. Well, one thing that I think really kept Gary afloat up to that time was that he always saw himself as an academic, as somebody that had the connections to the university, that got his PhD from the University of Washington. They're the ones that trained him to build what he developed. So for them to go and bring in Bill Gates who didn't have a college degree, and so forth. So Gary went to Helmut Goldie, who was the organizer for that event, and said, look, how could you have Bill do that? And Helmut's answer was, well, he's put millions of dollars into the University of Washington. Well, that was literally that tipping point. At that point in time, it seemed that Bill Gates had been able to use his millions to take over this academic, if you will, position and reputation that Gary had with the University of Washington. That was very difficult for him to handle. That was also Gary's motivation to write his Computer Connections, his book on the whole industry. So that started that process. And after that point, Gary began withdrawing from people. And so that was 92. In February of 93 was that 25th anniversary at the University of Washington. And a year and a half later, in July of 94, he passed away.
And that book we've mentioned a couple of times. The copyright is owned by Kristen and Scott, the children, and they have given the museum permission to publish the first half of it. They've asked us not to release the second half for at least 50 years, and largely because Gary was venting in that book, and they didn't think that showed the side of their father that they felt was appropriate. So, 50 years' time, if anyone's around, go knock on the door of the Computer History Museum. You'll be able to see the rest. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Tom, I think from what you said, that I'm correct here, did it turn out that you did not, you agreed not to sue Seattle Computing?
That is correct. The question is, did we agree then with IBM in signing the contract with them not to sue IBM or Microsoft? And that is correct. We did sign that contract.
Was there another chance at any point to litigate the problem, the disagreement?
There could have been other points. I think what happened a little later on, maybe some of you have used DRDOS. That was a follow-on product from Digital Research. And this was a chance or time for Digital Research to turn the tables. The UK group of engineers, great group of engineers, put together a clone, basically, if you will, of PC-DOS or MS-DOS. So in other words, they used the same file system, they used the extended calls that were in that operating system. And so the challenge was, okay, we have now copied your operating system, Microsoft, come and sue us. And that was kind of the strategy that went at that point. They did not sue Digital Research.
So you already had a suit against Seattle Computer, and then IBM convinced you to pull that suit?
That's right, the suit went away.
Just the idea of little DRI suing IBM, though, must have been a pretty scary thought. I don't think they ever... Well, Seattle product, no problem, but IBM, it would have been a whole different issue. Right.
I should make a comment, what's happening. I'm sure all of you have heard about open source, and that's a big part of GitHub and all these places that are distributing many APIs and many interfaces. Well, that right now, if we were to say right now today, if we were to go out and develop an operating system and publish an API today in this environment, that would not be protected by a copyright. That would be published as an interface. So the evolution over the last 40 years has been more towards that open source. But back at the time we introduced this, it was a copyrighted. The copyright notice was on every page of the source listings. It was in the documentation and the manuals. But nobody had litigated any kind of protection of software at that time.
I thought that IBM copyrighted the BIOS for the PC-1.
I don't believe they, I don't think you could copyright a BIOS. Maybe they copyrighted their own code for the IBM PC, but the BIOS was basically an interface between the operating system and the physical hardware.
I thought Eagle Computer, one of the first clones, used the PC BIOS, and they got themselves in a world of trouble, and then they had to clone it from Phoenix Computer into
Okay.
cloning.
I see what you're asking. Code of the BIOS, which is the confusion I had here in the question. You can't copy the code, but the interface itself, you had to recreate the BIOS that was for the IBM compatible. So you had to proceed.
Yes, sir.
Tom, I was wondering it seemed to me that digital research sort of spread itself very wide, very quickly. It got away from the core CPM with so many other products. And that was contributed towards its lack of focus and ultimately its failure in the market. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, the question is, did digital research expand into too many areas, and did that contribute to the problems that it had later on? I think it did to some extent. What digital research was trying to do is balance between providing the operating system and the tools for the developers and competing with the ISVs, the software vendors that were developing the applications. So it was trying to separate that. So we did move into a number of tools. Actually, the way, when Gary and I went off to start Knowledge Set, what had happened is Gary and I were actually a group within digital research, which was the consumer products division of two. And so we developed a couple of prototypes. And at one point in time, the board said, no, we do need to narrow our focus. We need to go back down to our concurrent DOS, our operating systems, and our tools, and stop this expansion into the consumer products. And so that actually gave Gary and I an opportunity to, at the board, say, well, we're interested in consumer. Is it okay if we go do that? Would you sign a release? And so that actually enabled Gary and I to go out and start Knowledge Set. So I was a recipient of that particular shrinking down.
Okay, well, I think we've covered most of the questions here. Are there one back there? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us something about GEM.
Okay. Jim, the graphic environment manager. Yeah, Lee Lorenzen, very capable engineer, was, actually recruited and hired from, I lost the name of the company. Anyway, he had done something called Lone Star, which was a graphical UI. And we were interested in expanding from character-based technology into graphical interfaces. And so Lee was brought in to develop GEM for us. And so GEM looked a lot like a Macintosh. You could develop applications that looked like the Macintosh. And so now digital research was in the position of getting sued by Apple. So before we knew it, once we announced GEM, we sat in a room full of lawyers from Apple that were ready to sue us because we had copied their graphical interface. So we had to make quite a number of changes. Some of them were silly things about visual effects, like expanding boxes and things like that we had to change to do that. But GEM was initially a good product and was used successfully in some applications.
Okay, well, thank everybody for coming. Especially thanks to Tom. And next time you walk past 801 Lighthouse Avenue, take a look at the plaque. You'll see that building in a whole different light once you've done that.